So if we went around the room and asked each of ourselves, what is the most important day of the year, we'd probably get a number of different answers. Although I'm guessing if we asked kids, we'd probably get one or two answers. It would probably either be their birthday, or what do you think the other day might be? Christmas. Yeah, that's sort of what I thought. Throughout the course of the year now, some of you, the most important day in your life, and this, sort of jokingly, but maybe not so much so, but it's probably coming up next week, and especially around this. But what's next Sunday? Forget religion for a second. The Daytona 500 next. And I know some of you are looking forward to that. And that, for us, for my wife and I, that was a before kids thing. We used to watch racing all the time. We used to take a nap in the afternoon on Sundays. And but since kids are along, it seems like we don't have time for that. But anyway, but seriously, the important days throughout the course of the year for most people, the big days, probably come down to two: Christmas, and another one being Easter. They're definitely important days within the life of the church, within the calendar year from the church. But even non-Christians and Christians alike, I think, share in those days. Obviously, not everybody, but a lot of people around us share in the importance of those 2 days. It can be big days in the life of a family to get together, the family and friends, and share in those days. Well, traditionally, over the life of the church, traditionally over the Christian calendar, if you will, and the Christian calendar hasn't always been with the church from the time of Jesus, but it's something that has been put into place from church throughout the years. And traditionally, these 2 days have become so big and so deemed so important, if you will, in the life of the church and the Christian life, that it says that we need time to prepare for them. And some churches, you'll hear this, and other churches you won't. It's just a matter of tradition. And it sort of breaks down. Some churches that we refer to as being sort of a high church, and some churches are a low church, and don't hear like good church versus bad church. And it's just different traditions of church. So some churches that are more high church would be the Roman Catholic Church, it would be the Lutheran Church, Episcopal, Anglican Church. Then there'd be other churches that would be lower church. Any Methodist church, it sort of all depends which church you go to. The way that we sort of function, we're sort of middle, probably to low church. But we still try to, throughout the year, acknowledge the seasons of the church year, the church calendar. So much so that, as we approach Easter and as we approach Christmas, we acknowledge the seasons, the times of preparation. Now, heading into Christmas, we have the season known as Advent. We just went through that. And approaching Easter, we have the season called Lent. And we started last week, Ash Wednesday service. It was a nice Ash Wednesday service, and unfortunately, the weather didn't fully cooperate, so it was hard to travel. It's one of those snows. The roads were okay, but it's one of those snows where it looked like you were going through the twilight zone when you're traveling around. You had the lights on. And just for fun, right? You turn the high beams on just to see how bad it is. And so that's what it was like, and it was a little bit hard to get out last week. But Ash Wednesday again, and so we started the season of Lent, preparing us for Good Friday and Easter to come. Now, throughout Lent, we're going to be in a sermon series. We just finished up one last week, and we're starting a new sermon series throughout the course of Lent, leading up into Easter. The sermon series title for us over the next couple of weeks through Lent is called An Old Testament Jesus, an Old Testament Jesus. And you might be asking yourself, so I didn't know Jesus was in the Old Testament. And you'd be pretty much right. You won't look in the index and say Jesus, and you'll find him specifically referenced there. But there is a looking ahead towards. There is the promise of the Messiah, of the Christ, of the Anointed One. And that's what we're going to look at. Where in the Old Testament do we see them talking about God's promise of the one to come? Or where do we see the prophecies of what the one to come, the Messiah, the one that we call Jesus, what would he have to go through? What would he have to suffer? What would he do? And so we're going to look at that, and that's what we mean as we're looking back and referring to an Old Testament Jesus. Now, to make sure that you're confused, we are going to look for Jesus in the Old Testament where by name he's not really found, and we're going to start, as by way of introduction this morning, with a New Testament story. So we're going to be going back and forth. This morning's story I want to share with you is from the New Testament, and one of the main characters in this story is Jesus. Now, as you heard, read, and we'll read through it again, just highlighting a couple of parts along the way, it's interesting, or peculiar, if you will, because the two people that Jesus is with don't recognize him. It says that God sort of made them not see him, which seems a little peculiar. But so we have Jesus, sort of main character of the story, but the people don't realize he's the main character of the story. And the main character, Jesus, is talking about Jesus, and he's talking about himself as he's looking back in the Old Testament. And but story goes from Luke chapter 24, and where we began earlier. I'll read most of it actually, and then I want to close with some that I did here this morning. But it's from chapter 24, beginning with verse 13. It's the encounter on the Emmaus Road. It says, on that same day, 2 disciples were traveling to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. So they had been where they'd been in Jerusalem. And we have to remember the setting of the time of the prior verses to these verses within this chapter are talking about the empty tomb. So if we read actually one more verse, it says, they were talking to each other about everything that had happened. So we had these disciples, the followers of Jesus Christ, not necessarily part of the 12 or part of the 11 if you take out Judas, but they were still considered themselves disciples. They still considered themselves followers of Jesus Christ. And they were just in Jerusalem, and they were talking about the things that had just happened in Jerusalem. So what just happened? I know they reiterate a little bit, just to remind ourselves of the setting. These guys were walking away from Jerusalem after having just witnessed Jesus being died on the cross. They were with Jesus. They were following him. They saw amazing things. They were his disciples. They were followers of Jesus Christ. And they saw him doing amazing things. They saw him come into Jerusalem sort of triumphantly. But we know that that didn't end too well. At least the way that we would have thought things would have ended. Coming into Jerusalem triumphantly, he is taken. Jesus is taken. He's arrested. He's beaten. He's persecuted. He has suffered. And he is then taken and he's put on the cross where he dies a shameful, humiliating, and painful death. And these disciples, they just witnessed that. And they were through that. They were through the highs and lows. I mean, we go through some highs and lows in our lives, but all that happened within 1 week. The triumphal entry of Jesus, and then Jesus, they probably were there in the Last Supper, the upper room with Jesus, sharing that close, intimate setting. Then to see Jesus being taken away, arrested, and then, out of nowhere, seemingly out of nowhere, Jesus is taken and persecuted and hung on the cross and died. So their minds are a little foggy. I use the term foggy once in a while in my own life. Maybe you guys do. They were a little foggy with everything they were going through. So along their way, along their journey, and they were talking about each other, about everything that had just happened. That's everything that just happened. There was a lot that just happened in their life. But it says in verse 15, while they were discussing these things, Jesus himself arrived and joined them on their journey. Now this is what I was sort of mentioned before, verse 16. It says they were prevented from recognizing him. So we have these two individuals, and Jesus comes along, but for some reason, God sort of, keeps Jesus' image or revelation of who Jesus is away from them for a time period. Now, I looked at this situation, I'm thinking, even if it doesn't say verse 16, that, I'm not sure these guys would recognize Jesus anyway. They just saw him die, I don't know about you, but with me, I just had this happen a few weeks ago. We were in a setting, it was a snowy morning as well. We went to sign, I had Rachel with me, we went to sign her up for a t-ball softball, and there I saw somebody, but it took me a couple of days later to remember who it was, and because I ran into his wife. But you ever run into people in a place where you're not expecting them, and you're like, who is it? And you look at each other, and it's like, well, we know that we know each other, but from where and who, and that experience happened to me. So even if God didn't, hold back who Jesus was to these individuals, I got to think they were sort of confused enough that it might have taken them a little bit. But anyway, in verse 16 it says, they were prevented from recognizing him. They were prevented from recognizing Jesus. So Jesus, in 17, says to them, what are you talking about as you walk along? They stopped, their faces downcast at Jesus. Jesus just went through all this. He says, what are you talking about? And we see the disciples, how they were feeling. It says their faces are downcast. So they're confused. They're depressed, they're upset, they're maybe even angry. They're just sort of downcast, it says. Verse 18 says, the one named Cleopas replied, are you the only visitor? Are you the only one? Everybody knows what's going on in Jerusalem. You're telling me you're the only one that doesn't know what just happened, what just took place? So he goes on. And Jesus, in verse 19, says to them, what things? What just happened? Can you imagine Jesus sort of going to them and is like, what are you talking about? We see it, if we get to the end of the story, they eventually learn that it was Jesus talking to them. But for Jesus to respond back, well, what are you talking about? What things happened? What things happened? So they go on, they tell Jesus, ironically, they tell Jesus what happened. In verse 19 continues, it says, they said to him, the things about Jesus of Nazareth. Because of his powerful deeds and words, he was recognized by God and all the people as a prophet. But our chief priests and our leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death. We might have forgotten about the people that said crucify him too. And they crucified him. We had hoped he was the one who would redeem Israel. So here they had an idea about who they thought Jesus was. So listen to verse 21. We'll come back to this in just a minute too. Verse 21 says, we had hoped he was the one who would redeem Israel. All these things happened 3 days ago. But there's more. Some women from our group have left us stunned. They went to the tomb early this morning and didn't find his body. So basically the first Easter morning is when this conversation is taking place. And they didn't find his body. They came to us saying that they had even seen a vision of an angel who told them he was alive, that Jesus is alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found things just as the woman said. They didn't see him. They didn't see him. Verse 25, Jesus says to them, you foolish people. Seems a little harsh if you ask me. But Jesus says, you foolish people, your dull minds keep you from believing all that the prophets talked about. They thought Jesus was the one. They thought Jesus was the one that talked about that was going to come and redeem Israel. But they were confused. They thought that he was going to come, that he was just going to reign and rule over them. Verse 26, Jesus begins to explain. He says, wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and then enter into his glory? Then he interpreted for them the things written about himself in all the scriptures, starting with Moses and going through all the prophets. When they came to Emmaus, he acted as if he was going on ahead, but they urged him, saying, stay with us, it's nearly evening and the day is almost over. So he went in to stay with them. After he took his seat at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed and broke it. Does it remind you of anything? Remind you of words that we share at communion? Actually, at Ash Wednesday services, we shared Pastor Chuck there, and he broke the bread. He repeated in reference back to this story, this image. It says in verse 30, it says, after he took his seat at the table with them, he took the bread, he blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Their eyes were open, and they recognized him, but he disappeared from their sight. So when did they realize who Jesus was? In the breaking of the bread. That's when their eyes were open, and it was revealed to them who Jesus was. And then their minds started racing. I mean, you can only imagine what was going through their minds. That was Jesus. I mean, he is alive, right? This was the one. And it's interesting, if we keep on reading, they started to realize that. They talked about, verse 32, they said to each other, weren't our hearts on fire when he spoke to us along the road and when he explained the scriptures for us? They got up right then and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11, their companions gathered together. They were saying to each other, the Lord really has risen. The Lord really has risen. He appeared to Simon. And when the two disciples described what had happened along the road and how Jesus was made known to them as he broke the bread, these disciples were rather excited. They were excited to realize that Jesus is alive. Now, Jesus is alive. So they saw Jesus arrested. They saw Jesus put and died on the cross. They saw him, maybe even taken away, put in the tomb. And now they just saw him alive. That is, something that our whole belief is rested on. But that's something that a lot of people struggle with, a lot of people wrestle with, some non-Christians don't believe or accept. But, just to think about it a little bit, I mean, what we're reading from isn't just a storybook. I mean, in many ways, it's a historical document that's been through the test of time for really almost centuries. It's been written down. The Pacific story that we're talking about would have been written down in the time period where there would have been eyewitnesses. They could have argued for it or against it, and yet we still have it with us today. Still here, we're still reading through it, we're still talking about it. And the other example, asking the question, looking at what happened, these disciples were downcast. Even here in the story, the disciples were downcast. Whenever they realize that Jesus is alive, what do? They get up, they go, they're excited, they go, and they tell the others, In fact, if we look before the time, we see Peter. You guys, many of you know how that worked out for Peter. Right before Jesus was taken and was taken on the cross, Peter was asked by, seemingly a young girl, well, aren't you with him too? As Jesus is getting, carried away, going, eventually to the cross. And Peter does what? He denies him. Denies that he knows him. But yet, as we read through the Bible, we have the evidence here too to speak to the fact that Peter goes from being sort of a wimp and a coward to being one of the forerunners, one of the ones that proclaims the good news. So much so he's willing to die for it. So going to, basically not being able to stand up to a little young girl that says, do you know him, to being able to die for him. The evidence is of Jesus, being alive. As Christians, we believe that Jesus is alive. We believe the tomb is empty and he lives today. So we want to look at the life of Jesus. One of the things that Jesus does, though, is he, in conversation with these individuals here on this road, verse 27, he has a little Bible study with them. Now, I remember a professor in seminary, New Testament professor in seminary, says, wouldn't that have just been the best Bible study to have sat through? Jesus himself going, from, it sounds like a long one, too. That's probably what most of you are thinking. Going through, starting with Moses and going the whole way through. I mean, that might take a little bit of time. But we have Jesus having basically a Bible study with them. In verse 27 it says, then he interpreted for them the things written about himself, about Jesus, in all the scriptures. The scriptures then would have been basically our Old Testament that we have today. Starting with Moses and going through all of the prophets. So basically an Old Testament study of where they talked about, where they were looking ahead to Jesus. Or in those days it would have been talking about the Messiah. Just a couple of terms. And since we just picked on Peter, we'll lift him up here as well. Matthew chapter 26. It talks about Jesus and Peter to have a conversation. Jesus is asking the disciples, who did people say that I am? And Peter responds. Simon Peter said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. A couple of terms. We hear the term Messiah. We hear the term Christ. Well, the term Messiah is a Hebrew term, quite literally a Hebrew term, a Hebrew word. Whenever the Messiah, a closely translated Hebrew word to Messiah is the anointed. So you have Messiah, but if you would translate that, it would basically mean the anointed. In the Old Testament time of God's people, they would anoint kings, they would anoint priests, they would anoint prophets. They would be used and consecrated into their service. So you have the Messiah, you have the anointed. Christ, basically, or Christ is basically the Greek word that is translated from Hebrew. The Old Testament was all written in Hebrew. Whenever it was first translated into Greek, it was called the Septuagint, and the word that they used would be our word that we use for Christ. So Messiah, Christ, the anointed one, basically all of that's the same words. But looking ahead, whenever they talked about the Messiah in the Old Testament, when they talked about the anointed one, if you will, they would anoint kings and priests and prophets, but in a sense they would always be looking ahead. They always talked about a time where they thought the Messiah, the anointed one, would come and basically redeem. We heard that, right? We heard that in the story. We heard that with the disciples. Where they thought that, where they thought that the Messiah, the anointed one, was going to come. Whenever they say here, in verse 21, it says, we had hoped he was the one who would redeem Israel. They thought when the Messiah, they thought that when the anointed one, they thought whenever that person came in, this king, the king of Israel would come, that then they would just reclaim that they would redeem Israel and things would just be great. Basically bringing heaven on earth. They didn't. Whenever Jesus came in and died on the cross, that threw them for a loop. They were confused. So Jesus comes and he has a story and he talks to them and he basically has a Bible study. He looks in the Old Testament and says, no, this is me. This is me. It is right. What Peter said, that I'm the Christ, that you're looking for, the Messiah, the anointed one, the Christ. That is me. And here's the evidence of that. So over the next couple of weeks leading up into Easter, we're going to go back and look at some of the promises of the one that was going to come, of the anointed one, of the Messiah. We'll look at some of the prophecies found in the Old Testament. I can promise you one thing, it won't be as good as the Bible study that that Jesus had with the disciples, but I think the hope of the matter, there's two big things that I want us to get out of this. One, the first one is this. I want us to be reminded of the fact that, God is at work. God is at work. This is Jesus entering history, and he's able to look back from the beginning of time, beginning of history, through Moses, through the prophets, and he's able to look at, here's where God is working, here's where God is promising, here's where this is happening, this is what it's going to look like, this is what is going to happen. Throughout all of creation, throughout all of history, God is at work. God is at work. God is bringing out his divine plan. And the scary part is sometimes we don't know it. Or maybe it should scare us even a little bit more that God's plan can go on without us. Now, God doesn't want that to happen. God wants us to be part of his divine plan. But God is at work. So over and over again, as we see and we're reminded of God working through all of history, we want to remind ourselves that God is at work. And the other thing, probably without, this is pretty obvious, that we want to remind ourselves that it's all about Jesus, right? It's all about Jesus. From the beginning, it's about the one that was going to come to save, not just Israel, but all of the people. Jesus was going to come, the Messiah was going to come, he was going to have to suffer, he was going to die, and Jesus did, and Jesus is the one. It is all about Jesus. It's all about Jesus. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So we want to focus on the fact that God is at work, and he's still at work. His divine plan is still being lived out around us each and every day. We see a little bit, a lot of things we don't see. But God is at work. He's been at work from the beginning to now until all of the end of time. And it's all about Jesus. We want to remind ourselves of that. Just close with this thought. Whether you're a Christian or not a Christian, if you're looking at, I was thinking about news cycles, and news cycles, traditionally I think they ran from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m., and you'd actually, at that point, have to turn into the 6 o'clock news to get the news. But if you just watch the news at 6 o'clock one afternoon and don't tune into anything until the next afternoon, you're missing You're missing a lot of different stuff, right? I think the news cycles these days are probably 6 minutes long. It just seems like you hear one tidbit of news and then something else comes and takes its place. But if you find yourselves hearing a name or hearing an event, do you find yourself getting curious as to who is that individual? What is that circumstance? What is that event? If you keep hearing about it, maybe day in and day out, maybe for a certain time period. And for example, the individual, unfortunately, the cop out in California, you guys undoubtedly heard about that. Some of you probably found yourself wanting to know more. What is that situation? What is going on? And you searched around the internet, found some more stories, found some more, for someone that will make the news cycle for how long? A couple of weeks, maybe a month. But here, if we think about Jesus, he's basically been making the quote-unquote news cycle since what? Before time. Over and over again. All of history speaks to him, points to him, talks about him. So I think, an individual that important, we're going to spend a couple of weeks specifically looking at in the Old Testament, looking for the promises, the prophecies concerning him. And we won't cover everything, but we'll cover some more, and hopefully we'll all learn a little bit more about Jesus and his promises in the next couple of weeks. And during the season of preparation as we prepare for Easter, let us pray.